A blind baby is abandoned in the darkness of the mountain, where no man dares to step. Years later, a knight emerges from the shadows, riding an untamed beast, and his gaze sees far beyond what anyone can imagine. The sky darkened over the Blue Ridge Mountains as Richard Sterling gazed one last time at the horizon through the window of his office. An imposing man dressed in an impeccable suit, he observed the empire he had built at the foot of the mountain. From the height of his penthouse, the business center of New Horizons seemed tiny, as did the people moving about below. "Mr. Sterling, the documents for the mining company acquisition are ready for your signature," announced Marcia, his secretary, interrupting his thoughts. Richard didn't respond immediately. His cold eyes remained fixed on the landscape, while his mind traveled to the only subject that truly disturbed him. "Any news from the hospital?" he asked in a deep voice, without looking away from the window. Mrs. Elizabeth sent a message. "The diagnosis was confirmed, sir." A heavy silence filled the room. The secretary, accustomed to her boss's coldness, knew this moment was different. In the 15 years working for Richard Sterling, she had never seen him show any sign of weakness. But at that moment, something in his gaze had changed. "You may go, Marcia." Alone, Richard poured himself a whiskey and walked to a side table where a picture frame with a photo of Elizabeth, his wife, rested. 6 months pregnant, she smiled with a joy that he had never truly been able to feel. "Blind," he murmured to himself as he swirled the amber liquid in the glass. "My son will be born blind." In the Sterling mansion, located in the most upscale part of the city, Elizabeth rested in her bed. At 35, her beauty remained intact, but her expression carried a profound sadness. She caressed her belly while silent tears ran down her face. "Don't listen to your father, my little one," she whispered to the baby she carried. "You'll be perfect." The phone rang, startling her. It was Louise, her younger sister, and the only person she truly trusted. "How are you feeling, Liz?" asked Louise, concerned. "He won't accept it, Lou. Since we learned about the diagnosis, Richard barely looks at me. It's as if our son were a defect." On the other end of the line, Louise sighed heavily. "Richard has always been obsessed with perfection, you know that. But when the baby is born, everything will change. He'll fall in love with his son just like any father would." Elizabeth wanted to believe those words, but she knew her husband too well to nurture such hopes. Richard Sterling was a man of extremes, who grew up hearing from his own father that weakness had no place in their family. 3 months later, on a rainy dawn, Ethan Sterling was born. A healthy baby, with small hands that waved in the air and a strong cry that echoed through the maternity ward. His eyes, though unable to see, were of a deep blue like the mountain sky on summer days. In the hospital corridor, Richard remained motionless, unable to enter the room and meet his son. The doctor approached with cautious steps. "Mr. Sterling, your wife and the baby are doing well. Little Ethan is a strong and healthy boy. The visual impairment won't prevent him from having a full life with proper treatments and—" "Are you absolutely certain of the diagnosis?" interrupted Richard, his voice sharp as a razor. "Unfortunately, yes. The condition is irreversible, but there are assistive technologies that can—" Richard raised his hand, silencing the doctor. "Thank you, doctor. Now, if you'll excuse me." Instead of entering the room where his wife and son awaited him, Richard Sterling headed for the hospital exit. The rain was falling mercilessly when he got into his car and drove toward his office. In the rearview mirror, the image of the hospital diminished until it disappeared, much like the possibility of the future he had planned. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The first months after Ethan's birth were marked by a cutting silence in the Sterling mansion. Elizabeth devoted herself entirely to her son, compensating with double love for her husband's indifference. Richard, in turn, buried himself deeper in his work, arriving late and leaving before dawn, avoiding any contact with the baby. "It's been 3 months, Richard. You've barely looked at your son," Elizabeth confronted him on a rare night when they dined together. "I'm busy securing this family's future," he answered dryly, without taking his eyes off the financial newspaper. What family? You act as if... Ethan doesn't even exist. Elizabeth's voice trembled between anger and hurt. He needs his father, not just a bank account. Richard finally looked up, his face hardened by something beyond anger. What he needs, Elizabeth, are the best doctors, the best specialized schools, and a structure that I need to work to maintain. Sentimentality won't restore his vision. It's not about restoring what he never had. It's about accepting him as he is. The businessman rose abruptly, leaving his napkin on the table. I'll sleep at the office. I have an important meeting early tomorrow. That night, alone in his office, Richard opened a bottle of whiskey while contemplating the photograph of his own father on the wall. Robert Sterling, a man who had built from nothing the beginning of what was now his empire, looked at him with severe eyes, even through that static image. "What would you have done, father?" he murmured to the portrait. "A Sterling who cannot see the empire he must command one day." The following weeks brought more tension to the marriage. Elizabeth threatened to leave with her son, while Richard became more distant. It was on a Wednesday, when Elizabeth traveled to Atlanta for a medical consultation with Ethan, that something changed within him. Alone in the mansion, Richard entered his son's room for the first time. The space was carefully decorated with light wood furniture and pastel-colored walls. Over the crib, a mobile of stars and planets hung motionless. He touched the small pieces, making them spin gently. "What good is a universe you'll never be able to see?" he whispered, feeling a suffocating anguish take over his chest. At that moment, a decision began to form in his mind. A definitive solution, born not of hatred, but of a cold and calculating rationale that had always guided his business. In his distorted logic, it was mercy. 2 days later, with Elizabeth still out of town, Richard put his plan into action. He dismissed the employees for 24 hours, claiming a house fumigation. When night fell, he entered the baby's room. Ethan slept peacefully, oblivious to what was about to happen. With trembling hands, he picked up his son for the first time. The contact provoked a strange sensation, which he quickly suppressed. He wrapped the baby in a blanket and headed to the garage. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose imposingly under the starry sky when Richard began the ascent on the winding road. His black Jaguar cut through the night, taking him higher and higher, away from civilization. He knew that region well. He had bought extensive lands there for future developments. After almost 2 hours, he reached an isolated plateau. He turned off the engine and remained motionless for a few minutes, while Ethan continued to sleep in the back seat. The silence of the mountain was interrupted only by the distant howling of the wind between the stone peaks. "It's better this way," he said to himself as a final justification. He got out of the car and walked a few yards looking for a suitable spot. A small clearing between low bushes seemed appropriate. He returned to the vehicle and picked up the baby, who was beginning to wake up. Ethan's blue eyes, though unable to see, seemed to fix on his father's face. For a brief moment, something broke inside Richard, a hesitation that was soon smothered by his unwavering determination. He placed his son in the clearing, adjusting the blanket around him. From a distance, a neigh cut through the silence of the night, followed by the sound of hooves beating against stones. Richard startled, looking nervously around, but saw nothing beyond the shadows of trees dancing under the faint moonlight. When the sound of the Jaguar's engine disappeared in the distance, a heavy silence took over the clearing. Ethan began to cry, his wailing echoing among the ancient stones of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The clouds drifted in the sky, revealing an almost full moon that bathed the region in a pale and mysterious light. The wind changed direction, carrying the baby's cry deeper into the forest. Among the century-old trees, something moved. Attentive eyes watched. Dilated nostrils caught the scent of the small, abandoned being. A powerful neigh cut through the silence of the night. Emerging from the shadows as if he were part of them, a black horse of majestic stature cautiously approached the clearing. It was Shadow, the spirit of the mountain, as the ancient natives called him. A wild animal that had never let itself be tamed, whose hooves had never known horseshoes, whose back had never borne a rider. With slow and precise steps, the horse came close to the baby. Its warm breath dispelled the night cold that was beginning to envelop Ethan. The animal lowered its head, its deep black eyes studying the small creature who now stopped crying, as if feeling the protective presence. Shadow remained there, like a silent guardian, until the first rays of sun began to tint the horizon. With surprising gentleness for an animal of its size, it used its muzzle to adjust the blanket around the baby, protecting him from the morning dew. Then, neighing softly, as if calling for help, it stepped back a few yards and waited. Not far from there, in the simplicity of a wooden and stone house, Joe Bennett woke up startled. At 67, the old farmer knew every sound, every whisper of the mountain where he had been, born and raised, and that neigh was not common. "Rose, are you hearing that?" he asked his wife, who was sleeping deeply beside him. The woman, 10 years younger than her husband, opened her eyes slowly. "What is it, Joe?" "The black horse. He's calling?" Rose sat up in bed, still sleepy, but accustomed to respecting her husband's intuitions. Joe Bennett was known in the region for his almost supernatural connection with the mountain and its inhabitants. It must be just an animal passing by, she tried to calm him. "No, woman. It's Shadow, and he never calls without reason." Joe Bennett got up, put on his simple clothes, and grabbed a flashlight, although the morning light was already sufficient to guide him. "Come with me, Rose. Something happened in the ancients' clearing." The couple walked for almost half an hour, following a trail known only to the natives of the region. When they reached the clearing, the spectacle left them speechless. Shadow, the untamable, remained there, standing guard over something small, wrapped in a blue blanket. "My God, Joe, it's a baby!" exclaimed Rose, running toward the child. Surprisingly, the horse did not move away when the couple approached. It remained there, watching attentively as Rose picked up Ethan, checking if he was all right. "He's cold but seems healthy," she said, pressing the baby against her chest to warm him. "Who would do such a thing?" Joe knelt, examining the marks on the ground around them. Footprints from expensive shoes. "A man from the city," he murmured, following the trail to where the car had been parked. "Came by car and left the child here during the night." "But how did he survive the cold of dawn?" questioned Rose, cradling the baby, who now slept peacefully in her arms. The old farmer looked at the black horse, which remained a few yards away, its eyes fixed on the child. "It was Shadow who protected him, and it was he who called us." Rose looked at her husband and then at the animal, understanding the meaning of it all. For years they had tried to have a child, without success. The midwives of the region said her womb was as dry as the earth in times of drought. "Joe, this boy," she began hesitantly, "is a gift from the mountain woman," he completed, approaching to better examine the baby. "Look at his eyes." Carefully, Rose moved the blanket away from the child's face. Ethan opened his eyes, revealing irises of a deep blue that seemed to fix on nothing. "He can't see," Rose observed, feeling her heart tighten. "Maybe that's why they abandoned him," responded Joe, gently touching the tiny hand that grabbed his finger with surprising strength. "But that doesn't matter to us." A silent decision was made at that moment. Rose looked at her husband, a mute question in her eyes that were already filling with tears. "We'll take him home," confirmed Joe, putting his arm around his wife's shoulder. "The mountain has entrusted him to us." The disappearance of Ethan caused an earthquake in Elizabeth's life. Upon returning from Atlanta and finding an empty house, without staff and without her son, her world collapsed. Richard, with the coldness that characterized him, maintained the version that the baby had been taken by someone while he was at the office. "How could you leave him alone?" screamed Elizabeth, out of control, while police officers searched the mansion for clues. "I left for only 2 hours. The security guards were on the perimeter," lied Richard, perfectly playing the role of the desperate father. "We will find him, Elizabeth. I'm mobilizing all possible resources." In the following weeks, the search for Ethan became national news. The sterling fortune allowed them to hire private investigators and offer substantial rewards. Richard even appeared on television programs begging for his son's return, while Elizabeth withered, consumed by pain. "You're hiding something," Richard confronted Louise on a rainy afternoon, 3 months after the disappearance. "My sister is destroyed, and there's something in your look that doesn't fool me." "Are you accusing me of something?" "Louise," he replied, maintaining an impassive countenance. "I don't know what happened to my nephew, but I know you're not the destroyed man you pretend to be for the cameras." Richard approached, his voice low and threatening. "Take care of your sister and leave the investigations to the police. Your imagination will only bring more suffering to this family." While the drama unfolded in the city, in the simplicity of the mountain, Ethan found a new home. Joe Bennett and Rose decided to raise the boy as their son, registering him as Ethan Bennett, in honor of the mountain that had brought him to them. "He's strong like an oak sapling," commented Rose, observing the baby who grew healthy, despite his visual impairment. "And smart too, he feels things in a different way." Joe agreed, noticing how the boy seemed to perceive the presence of people and animals even before they made any sound. And more surprising was Shadow's constant vigilance. The black horse rarely moved away from the property, as if standing guard over the little one. "It's a blessing to have Ethan with us," said Rose, kissing the forehead of the baby who smiled upon hearing her voice. "But I can't help thinking about his mother, whoever she might be. She must be suffering a lot. The mountain has its mysteries, woman. If it brought the boy to us, it's because it had to be this way." The years passed. In the city, Richard and Elizabeth continued their lives, although the marriage had become a facade. The pain had transformed Elizabeth into a bitter woman who devoted herself obsessively to charity work for abandoned children. Richard, in turn, immersed himself even more in his ambition, expanding his business with an aggressiveness that frightened even his most experienced competitors. "No one can oppose Richard Sterling and remain standing," they commented in business circles, observing how he destroyed anyone who dared to cross his path. In the mountains, Ethan turned 6. He was a thin boy, with dark hair and blue eyes that, although they couldn't see, seemed to penetrate the soul of whoever looked into them. His connection with nature was already proving to be extraordinary. "Heavy rain's coming, Mother Rose," he announced on a sunny afternoon while playing in the yard. "Shadow is restless." Rose looked at the clear, cloudless sky but didn't question him. In the years of coexistence, she had learned that Ethan's perceptions rarely failed. In less than 2 hours, a violent storm descended upon the region. The boy's ability to orient himself without vision impressed everyone. He walked on steep trails without hesitation, identified plants by smell and texture, and developed an incredible sensitivity to sounds. But nothing compared to his relationship with Shadow. "Look, Joe," whispered Rose, watching through the kitchen window. "They're talking again." In the pasture adjacent to the house, Ethan was sitting on a rock, while the imposing black horse stood in front of him, head lowered, as if carefully listening to what the boy was saying. "It's not natural, woman," replied Joe, not hiding his amazement. "That horse never let anyone approach it before Ethan. The old folks said it has guarded the mountain for generations." That night during dinner, Ethan surprised his adoptive parents with an unexpected question. "Father Joe, who left me on the mountain when I was a baby." The old farmer choked on his soup, exchanging an alarmed look with Rose. "Why do you ask?" "That, son," she inquired, trying to buy time. "Shadow told me that someone took me to the clearing and then left in a big car," answered the boy naturally. "He said he protected me until you arrived." Time ran differently on the mountain. For Ethan, now 12 years old, the days unfolded in perfect harmony with the cycles of nature. While other children from the small rural community attended school in the nearest village, the boy received education at home, mainly from Rose, who had been a teacher before marrying Joe Bennett. "Ethan, can you feel the difference between these leaves?" asked Rose, placing specimens of various plants she had collected during her walks in the boy's hands. "This is sage," he answered, running his fingers over the first leaf. "And this is wild mint. They grow near the spring on the west side of the property." Rose smiled, proud. Her son's ability to identify plants just by touch and smell surpassed even Joe's knowledge, who had been born and raised on that land. "And what are they used for?" Sage is good for inflamed throats. Wild mint calms the stomach and repels insects when rubbed on the skin, recited the boy, repeating the teachings he absorbed with impressive ease. In the afternoons free from studies, Ethan spent hours in Shadow's company. The relationship between them deepened each day, crossing the boundary between human and animal, becoming something almost mystical that the residents of the region observed with a mixture of fascination and reverential fear. On that specific morning, while Joe was fixing a fence damaged by the last storm, he observed something he would never forget. Ethan approached Shadow in the pasture, as he did daily. The black horse, always vigilant, lowered its head upon feeling the boy's presence. "Today's the day, isn't it?" Joe heard his son say as if talking to a friend. "Are you sure I'm ready?" The farmer stopped his work, observing the unusual scene unfolding a few yards away. Shadow neighed softly, something rare for a usually silent animal, and turned sideways, positioning itself parallel to the boy. Ethan, who had never ridden before, who had never even seen the shape of a horse in his life, raised his hands until he found Shadow's back. With an agility that left Joe open-mouthed, the boy hoisted himself onto the animal in a fluid movement, as if he had done it hundreds of times. The old man dropped his tools and approached, fearful that Shadow might react badly and throw the boy off. But to his surprise, the horse remained perfectly still, allowing Ethan to adjust himself on its back. "Son, be careful," shouted Joe, alarmed. "That horse has never been ridden." Ethan turned his face in the direction of his adoptive father's voice, a serene smile on his lips. "Don't worry, father. Shadow taught me how to do this. We're ready." Before Joe could protest again, the horse began to move. First a slow step, then another, until initiating a gentle trot. Ethan maintained himself perfectly balanced. His hands lightly rested on the dark mane, his body moving in perfect synchrony with the animal. "Rose!" called Joe, still in disbelief. "Come see this!" The woman came out of the house, drying her, hands on an apron, and froze at the sight of her son mounted on Shadow, circling the pasture in increasingly wider arcs. "My God, Joe. How is he doing that?" "I don't know, woman. It's as if the two were one." At that moment, something even more extraordinary happened. Shadow suddenly accelerated to a gallop, heading for the trail that led to the higher parts of the mountain. Joe and Rose screamed, terrified by the idea of their blind son on a wild horse in the dense forest. "Ethan, come back!" yelled Rose, running a few steps in their direction. But it was too late. Horse and boy had disappeared among the trees, Shadow's speed making any attempt to catch up impossible. "Let's go after them," said Joe, already running to get his hat. "Wait." Rose held her husband's arm, her eyes fixed on the point where Ethan had disappeared. "Remember what you always say? The mountain protects its own, and Ethan belongs to it as much as Shadow does." The old farmer hesitated, his heart divided between paternal fear and a strange certainty that his son would be safe. He decided to trust his wife's intuition and the inexplicable connection between the boy and the horse. During the following hours, the couple waited anxiously, alternating between hope and despair. When the sun began to set, tinting the sky with shades of orange and red, a familiar neigh announced the return of the two. Shadow appeared on the trail, his black coat glistening with water droplets, as if he had crossed a stream. On his back, Ethan smiled, his face illuminated by a joy that seemed to overflow. "Son, thank God!" exclaimed Rose, running to meet them. Ethan dismounted with the same ease with which he had mounted, caressing Shadow's neck with a gesture of profound gratitude. "Where have you been?" asked Joe, noticing something different about his son. "We were worried." "Shadow took me to the top of the mountain," answered Ethan, his face still radiant. "There where the ancient stones form a circle, he wanted to show me." "Show you?" Rose frowned, confused by the choice of words. Ethan turned to her, his blue eyes shining intensely. "I know it sounds strange, Mother. I can't see with my eyes. But Shadow taught me to see with other senses. Today I felt the mountain in a way I had never felt before." The couple exchanged intrigued looks, realizing that something profound and inexplicable had happened during that journey. It was as If the mountain spoke to me, continued the boy, walking toward the house with firm steps, without need of the cane he rarely used, and I think it has something important to tell me. The meeting room of Sterling Enterprises was in absolute silence. Richard, now 52, with grey hair at his temples and deep dark circles marking his face, hardened by the years, stared at the EE graphs projected on the wall. All indicators pointed downward, in a decline that seemed impossible to reverse. "The investors are abandoning ship, Mr. Sterling," informed Charles Mendez, his financial director. The hydroelectric bidding scandal drove away the last ones who still trusted the company. Richard remained impassive, although inside he felt the weight of each word like a sharp blade. In the last 5 years, his fortune and influence had drained away like water between his fingers. First were the cancelled international contracts, then the accusations of environmental irregularities, followed by betrayals from strategic partners. It was as if an invisible force conspired to destroy him. "How long do we have until bankruptcy?" he asked, his controlled voice masking the growing despair. 3 months, maybe 4, answered Charles, avoiding looking directly at his boss. "Unless we get the loan from the International Bank." "Which will say no, like all the others," completed Richard, rising abruptly. "The meeting is adjourned. Leave me alone." When the room emptied, Richard poured himself a generous dose of whiskey and walked to the window. Down below, the city that once seemed to belong to him now showed indifference to his fall. The empire he had built with relentless ambition was crumbling, and he didn't understand why. The intercom rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. "Mr. Sterling, your wife is on line 2, announced the secretary. Richard hesitated before answering. His marriage to Elizabeth had become an empty relationship based on appearances and social commitments. After Ethan's disappearance, she had never been the same, and he knew he was to blame, though he had never confessed his crime. "Elizabeth?" "Richard, we need to talk." Her voice sounded different, with a firmness he hadn't heard in years. "I'm leaving you." The words hit him like a punch, not out of love, which no longer existed, but because of the perfect timing to complete his ruin. "What are you saying?" "After all these years." 16 years living a lie, Richard," she interrupted. 16 years waking up next to the man who I believe is responsible for our son's disappearance. A heavy silence followed the accusation. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "You're disturbed, Elizabeth. You never got over the loss." "I'm not disturbed. I'm lucid for the first time since Ethan disappeared. Louise always suspected you, and I finally agree with her. I don't know what you did, but I know you did something." "Elizabeth, my lawyer will contact you. I want half of everything that's left, although I know it's not much. Your fall was as deserved as it was delayed, Richard." The call ended before he could respond. Richard remained paralyzed, the phone still in his hand, while his mind processed the final blow. He was losing everything: company, fortune, reputation, and now the last connection to the life he had built. That same night, after several glasses of whiskey, Richard was driving his car on the road leading to the mountains. It was the only place he could think to go. He owned an old property there, a rarely visited country house where perhaps he could hide while planning his next steps. The rain began to fall when he entered the winding road that climbed the mountain. Through the windshield wipers, he glimpsed a solitary rider at the roadside. The man rode an impressive black horse, and even with reduced visibility, Richard could note that there was something strange in the way he observed the road. He slowed, down intrigued, and when his headlights directly illuminated the rider, a chill ran down his spine. The young man mounted on the animal seemed not to care about the rain that soaked his simple clothes. His eyes, of an intense blue, stared at the emptiness in front of him, and Richard understood. The young man was blind. "It can't be," he murmured, braking abruptly a few yards ahead. He looked in the rearview mirror, but the rider and his animal had already disappeared, as if they had never been there. Richard rubbed his eyes, attributing the vision to excess alcohol and fatigue. He resumed the journey, but an unsettling feeling settled in his chest. Upon arriving at the country house, he found it in a state of abandonment. Dust covered the old furniture, and the smell of mold permeated the air. Even so, it was a shelter, and Richard urgently needed to reorganize his thoughts. He lit the fireplace and poured himself another drink. Outside, the storm intensified. With lightning cutting the sky and thunder shaking the windows, that's when he heard it. A powerful neigh, too close to be from an animal in the forest. Richard approached the window and pulled back the curtain. His heart almost stopped when he saw, illuminated by a lightning flash, the same black horse standing in the middle of the garden, now without its rider. The animal stared directly at the house, as if it knew exactly who was inside. "This isn't happening," murmured Richard, moving away from the window. But the neigh sounded again, louder and closer, and something in Richard's memory stirred. The night he abandoned Ethan on the mountain, he had heard an identical sound echoing among the trees. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. News spread quickly through the villages of the Blue Ridge Mountains. A large construction company was planning to build a luxury resort in the region, clearing a significant area of native forest. For the local residents, the threat was clear. Their lands, their way of life, and the nature they had preserved so well were at risk. They say the owner is a bankrupt businessman from the city, trying to recover his fortune at the expense of our mountain, commented Anthony, owner of the small general store that served as a meeting point for the community. Joe Bennett, now over 80 years old but still lucid and strong, listened attentively. At his side, Ethan, a young man of 19, absorbed every word with a grave expression. Over the years, the abandoned boy had transformed into a tall young man of elegant bearing, respected by everyone in the region, not only for his extraordinary connection with Shadow, but also for his wisdom that seemed to go beyond his years. "Who is this man, Mr. Anthony?" asked Ethan, his calm voice contrasting with the general concern. "Richard Sterling is his name. They say he was once one of the richest men in the country, but now he's almost penniless." Joe observed a subtle change in Ethan's posture. Something in the name seemed to affect him, but the young man maintained his serene countenance. "Where is he staying?" questioned the young man. "In the old Thompson house, that abandoned mansion near the lookout," answered Anthony. "He's renovating everything to transform it into the resort. He has already started hiring people from the region for the initial work." On the way back home, Joe noticed that Ethan was unusually silent. The young man walked beside him, his cane rarely touching the ground, guided more by his extraordinary perception of the environment than by the tool. "Something worries you, son?" asked the old man. "It's not worry, father," answered Ethan after a moment of reflection. "It's more like something is approaching, something I always knew would come one day." That night during dinner, Ethan surprised his adoptive parents with an unexpected announcement. "I'm going to apply for one of the jobs at Mr. Sterling's house," he declared, between one bite and another of Rose's stew. "What? Why?" Rose almost dropped the plate she was holding. "You've never been interested in working outside our land." "We need to know more about his plans for the mountain," explained Ethan with tranquility, "and something tells me I should meet him." Joe observed, his son with perceptive eyes. In recent months, Ethan had spent more time than usual in the high part of the mountain, always accompanied by Shadow. The old man suspected that the young man had received some kind of message from the mountain, as happened occasionally. "Is it Shadow who's asking for this?" he asked directly. Ethan smiled, accustomed to his adoptive father's sharp intuition. "Not just him, the entire mountain asks me." Rose and Joe exchanged worried looks, but they knew it was useless to argue. When Ethan spoke that way, there was no dissuading him. The next morning, the young man headed to the Thompson property. Shadow accompanied him to a certain point of the way, but stopped when they got close to the main road. The animal neighed softly, as if transmitting a final message. "I know," answered Ethan, caressing the horse's neck. "I'll be careful. You'll be nearby if I need you." The old Thompson mansion teemed with activity. Workers transported materials, while engineers consulted plans and a foreman shouted orders. Ethan approached the latter, his cane now more visible to avoid questions. "Good morning," he greeted. "I heard you're hiring people from the region. I came to offer myself for work. The foreman looked him up and down, his gaze stopping at the cane in the eyes that focused on nothing. Sorry, young man, we don't have work for someone with your condition. My condition doesn't prevent me from carrying weight or helping in the kitchen, answered Ethan without showing offense. I know every inch of this mountain and can be useful in many ways. Look, I understand, but any problem, Smith? The deep voice interrupted the conversation. Richard Sterling approached, his impeccable suit contrasting with the construction environment. At 52, he still maintained the haughty posture of his glory days, although the marks of time and worries were evident on his face. This young man wants to work, Mr. Sterling, but as you can see, he is perfectly capable, completed Ethan firmly. My name is Ethan Bennett. I grew up on this mountain and know its secrets better than anyone. Something in the young man's voice made Richard stop. He observed him more attentively, noting the blue eyes that seemed to see through people, the confident posture, the facial features that awakened a strange familiarity. How old are you, Ethan? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. 19, sir. Richard felt his heart accelerate. The age matched, and those eyes. Hire him, he ordered abruptly, turning to the foreman. He can help in the house, organizing the project files. He'll start tomorrow. But, sir, how is he going to organize documents if he can't? Smith, when I give an order, I expect it to be fulfilled, Richard cut him off coldly. The young man starts tomorrow, and provide a room for him in the staff wing. When Richard walked away, the foreman looked at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. Seems like you have a guardian angel, boy. I've never seen the boss change his mind so quickly. Ethan smiled slightly, his senses capturing the disturbance that his presence had caused in Richard Sterling. It's not about angels, Mr. Smith. Sometimes, fate simply puts the right people in each other's path. Ethan's first week on the property was marked by distrust and curiosity from all sides. The workers observed with astonishment how the blind young man navigated the spaces with surprising autonomy, rarely stumbling or showing insecurity. Richard, for his part, found excuses to be near the young man, observing him with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Mr. Sterling seems very interested in you, commented Martha, the housekeeper, while guiding Ethan in organizing the library. I've never seen him so attentive to an employee. Maybe it's just curiosity, answered Ethan, his sensitive fingers organizing documents that, surprisingly, he could classify by the texture and smell of the paper. It's not every day someone hires a blind person to work with documents. Martha smiled, admiring the absence of bitterness in the young man's tone. You're different, Ethan. There's something about you I can't explain. They say growing up on the mountain does that to people, he replied with a calm smile. On a particularly hot afternoon, Ethan was working alone in the library when he felt Richard's presence. The businessman remained at the door for a few moments, observing the young man who efficiently organized a pile of old documents. How did you know they were architectural plans if you can't see them? Richard finally asked, entering the room. Ethan showed no surprise at the question or at the sudden presence. It was as if he already knew he was there. The paper is different, he explained naturally. Thicker, with a specific texture. And it has a characteristic smell of technical ink. My adoptive father taught me to identify materials by touch and smell. Your adoptive father? There was a poorly disguised anxiety in the question that didn't go unnoticed by Ethan. Joe and Rose Bennett, he answered, carefully placing a document in a folder. They've raised me since I was a baby. Richard approached, sitting in a chair nearby. Were you born blind? As far as I know, yes. My parents found me when I was just a baby, abandoned on the mountain. The businessman swallowed hard, his breathing changing slightly. Abandoned? That's terrible. And you never knew who your biological parents were? Ethan interrupted his work, turning his face toward Richard. His blue eyes, although unable to see, seemed to penetrate the businessman's soul. You seem very interested in my story, Mr. Sterling. Just curiosity, Richard replied, trying to keep his voice steady. It's an unusual story. As unusual as a bankrupt businessman who returns to a mountain he destroyed in the past, trying to rebuild his fortune at the expense of nature. The direct question caught Richard off guard. He observed the young man with a new perspective, realizing there was much more to this young man than appeared. "You speak like someone who knows me." "I know what the mountain tells me, Mr. Sterling, and it has a very long memory." A tense silence settled between them, broken only by the distant noise of workers in the garden. Richard suddenly felt exposed, as if all his secrets were written in large letters on his face, visible even to a blind person. "You have a horse, don't you?" he asked abruptly. "A black stallion. I saw you arriving on it the other day." It was Ethan's turn to seem surprised. "You saw Shadow?" "Is that his name? Shadow?" "Yes. He's been with me as long as I can remember. Some say he saved me when I was abandoned." Richard rose abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, dark clouds were beginning to form, announcing an approaching storm. "I need to tell you a story, Ethan," he said finally, his voice laden with contained emotion, "about a man who made the worst mistake of his life 16 years ago." Ethan remained silent, his expression impassive. Somehow he seemed to know what would come next. This man had everything: money, power, respect. When he discovered his son would be born with a disability, he felt. "Betrayed by fate," continued Richard, the words coming with difficulty. In his arrogance, he decided he didn't want a son he considered imperfect. Thunder sounded in the distance like an omen of the drama unfolding. One night, he put the baby in his car and drove to an isolated region of the mountains. He left the child there, convinced he was doing what was best for everyone. Richard's voice faltered. To his family, he said the baby had been kidnapped. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond Richard's words. "And what happened to this man?" he finally asked. "He prospered for a while, built an even larger empire, becoming untouchable. But then, everything began to crumble. Business, fortune, marriage. It was as if an invisible force was systematically dismantling his life." "Or perhaps it was just the price to pay for his choices," suggested Ethan, with a serene voice. Richard turned to face him, unshed tears glistening in his eyes. "The baby I abandoned that night had a birthmark, a small crescent-shaped mark behind his right ear." For the first time, Ethan's composure seemed to waver. Instinctively, his right hand moved to touch the exact spot behind his ear, where a mark identical to the one described by Richard had always been present. "How do you know about that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Because I am that." "Man, Ethan," answered Richard, approaching slowly, "and you are the son I abandoned." A heavy silence took over the library after Richard's confession. Outside, the storm approached, with lightning illuminating the darkened sky and thunder shaking the windows of the old mansion. Time seemed suspended between the two men, as if nature itself awaited the unfolding of that improbable reunion. Ethan remained motionless, processing the revelation that deep down he might have already suspected. His expression, previously serene, now showed a complexity of emotions he rarely let show. "You knew?" asked Richard finally, breaking the suffocating silence. "Is that why you came to work here, to confront me?" "No," answered Ethan with a controlled voice. "I came because the mountain asked me to. Now I understand why." Richard frowned, confused by the enigmatic response. "The mountain? What do you mean?" "The mountain speaks, Mr. Sterling. Not with words, but in other ways. It guided me here, just as it guided Shadow to me that night." A particularly intense lightning flash illuminated the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunder. The rain began to fall violently, lashing the windows of the mansion. "So, you don't hate me?" asked Richard, unable to comprehend the apparent calm of his son in the face of the revelation. Ethan rose slowly, his erect and confident figure contrasting with Richard's now curved posture. "Hate would be easy, Mr. Sterling, but the mountain taught me that carrying it is like transporting stones on a steep climb. In the end, the only one who suffers is the one who carries it." "I don't understand how you can speak like this." Richard advanced a step. "I abandoned you to die. I deprived you of your mother, your inheritance, everything that was rightfully yours. "And gave me the greatest gift I could have received," countered Ethan with simplicity. "A life in communion with nature, adoptive parents who loved me unconditionally, and Shadow. If I had grown up in your world of concrete and ambition, who knows what I might have become?" Richard felt the weight of those words. His own world was in ruins, while the son he had abandoned seemed to have found a fullness he had never known. "Your mother never got over your loss," he said with a choked voice. "Elizabeth spent years looking for you, until finally blaming me for your disappearance. Is she well? She divorced me recently, lives in Atlanta now, dedicating herself to social work for abandoned children." Ethan nodded slightly, as if approving of the path chosen by the mother he had never known. "And you? After losing everything, you returned to the mountain with what real objective?" Richard hesitated, feeling he couldn't lie to those eyes that, even without seeing, seemed to see through him. At first it was just business. Buy cheap land, build a luxury resort, recover part of my fortune. But after I saw you and Shadow on the road that night— "You saw us before?" "I thought it was a hallucination. A blind young man mounted on a black horse during a storm. But something inside me stirred, as if a forgotten part of my conscience was awakening. At that moment a powerful neigh sounded above the noise of the storm. Richard ran to the window and shuddered at what he saw. Shadow was standing in the mansion's garden, imposing under the rain, his black eyes fixed on the library as if seeing through the walls. "He's here," murmured Richard, instinctively backing away. Ethan smiled slightly, as if sharing a secret with the animal that not even Richard could understand. "He's always nearby when I need him. Shadow knows who you are, Mr. Sterling. He never forgot that night. The horse recognizes me." Shadow is not a common animal. The elders of the region say he has guarded the mountain for generations. No hunter has ever managed to capture him. No farmer has ever managed to tame him, until he found me that night. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The legends of the mountain, which he had always considered superstitions of simple people, now seemed to take on a real and disturbing dimension before his eyes. "What will happen now, Ethan?" he asked, an involuntary tremor in his voice. The young man walked confidently to the door without need of the cane he rarely used. "Now I'm going to ride Shadow to the top of the mountain, and you will accompany me." "In the storm? That's madness. The storm is just water and wind, Mr. Sterling. What you should fear are the secrets the mountain keeps and that the time has come to reveal." Before Richard could protest again, Ethan had already left the library. The businessman remained paralyzed for a few moments, divided between the fear of the unknown and a strange compulsion to follow his son. Finally, he grabbed a coat and headed for the door. In the drenched garden, Ethan was already mounted on Shadow, the rain running down his serene face. The horse, normally skittish with strangers, remained extraordinarily calm, as if it understood the importance of that moment. "You can use one of the horses from the stable," indicated Ethan, pointing to a building beside the house. "Don't worry about the rain. Some truths can only be revealed when we are stripped of comfort." Richard hesitated, looking at the stormy sky. His entire life had been built around control, calculation, predictability. What his son proposed was the exact opposite, surrendering to the unknown. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, the water running down his prematurely aged face. "It's not about trusting me," answered Ethan with serenity. "It's about finally trusting yourself, about listening to what you've always known, but never had the courage to admit." Something in the young man's words resonated deeply in Richard. Without further protests, he headed to the stable and, minutes later, returned mounted on a bay horse. His movements were awkward, revealing his lack of practice, a stark contrast to Ethan's natural elegance on Shadow. "Follow me," instructed the young man, guiding his horse to the trail that led to the highest part of the mountain. "And stay. Close? The storm will get worse before it gets better." The storm roared with growing fury as Ethan and Richard climbed the steep trail. The darkness was cut only by occasional lightning, which briefly illuminated the treacherous path ahead. For Richard, it was a nightmare of reduced visibility and slippery terrain. For Ethan, who had never depended on vision, It was just another journey on the mountain he knew like the back of his hand. Shadow advanced with confidence, his hooves finding firmness even in the most dangerous stretches. The bay horse, ridden by Richard, followed faithfully, as if understanding it should trust the black stallion ahead. "How can you know the way?" shouted Richard, trying to make himself heard over the roar of the wind. "I don't need to see to know," answered Ethan, his voice strangely clear despite the storm. "Some paths are engraved in the soul, not in the eyes." The enigmatic response only increased Richard's discomfort. He was soaked to the bone, exhausted, and for the first time in decades completely out of his element. The businessman who commanded meeting rooms with unwavering authority was now nothing more than a vulnerable man, at the mercy of nature and guided by a son he had abandoned. After almost an hour of arduous ascent, they reached an elevated plateau. To Richard's surprise, the storm seemed to contour that specific location, as if an invisible bubble protected it. The rain continued to fall around, but there in that circular space surrounded by ancient rock formations, the air was relatively dry and calm. "What is this place?" asked Richard, dismounting with difficulty, his legs trembling from the unusual effort. "The ancients called it the Stone Circle," explained Ethan, descending from Shadow with natural grace. "It's a place of judgment and revelations." Richard looked around, noting that the rocks formed a perfect circle, as if they had been placed there intentionally. In the center, a flat stone similar to an altar shone slightly under the diffuse light that managed to penetrate the clouds. "Judgment?" he repeated, an unease growing in his chest. "Don't fear, Mr. Sterling." Ethan smiled slightly, perceiving his biological father's apprehension. "The mountain doesn't judge like men do. It merely reveals the truth that already exists within us." Ethan walked to the center of the circle and gestured for Richard to follow. When both were on the flat stone, the young man raised his face to the sky as if he could see the turbulent clouds above. "This is where Shadow first brought me, when I was 12 years old," he recounted, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "He showed me what the mountain had been keeping for me." "What do you mean?" "The mountain keeps memories, Mr. Sterling, in the stones, in the trees, in the soil. Everything that happens here is recorded in some form." As he spoke, Ethan knelt and touched the surface of the stone with both hands. At his gesture, Shadow approached, positioning himself behind the young man like a vigilant guardian. "Place your hands on the stone," instructed Ethan. Hesitantly, Richard obeyed, kneeling on the opposite side and resting his palms on the cold surface. The instant he did so, a strange sensation ran through his body like a gentle but persistent electric current. "What's happening?" he whispered, feeling a slight vertigo. "The mountain is showing what you need to see." The world around Richard began to change. The clouds dissipated in his vision, and the sky became starry, exactly as on that night 16 years ago. With growing horror and fascination, he saw himself reliving the moment he left baby Ethan in that distant clearing. But now he saw the scene from a different angle, as if he were an observer, not the protagonist. He saw himself moving away in the black jaguar, and then something he had never witnessed. Shadow emerging from the shadows, cautiously approaching the abandoned baby, protecting him with his powerful body throughout the cold night. "He was there the whole time," murmured Richard, silent tears running down his face. The vision continued, showing brief flashes of Ethan's childhood, his first steps guided by Rose, Joe's lessons about medicinal plants, the extraordinary bond that developed between the boy and Shadow. Scenes of a simple life but rich in affection, connection, and purpose. Contrasting with these images came flashes of Richard's own life during the same period, the growing wealth, the emotional emptiness, the superficial relationships, the crumbling marriage, and finally, the vertiginous fall of his empire. "The mountain doesn't just keep the past," Ethan's voice seemed to come from far away. "It also shows possibilities." The vision changed again, and Richard saw two versions of the future unfolding side by side. In one, he continued with his plans for the resort, destroying part of the native forest and irremediably altering the fragile balance of that ecosystem. In this path, he saw himself completely alone in his final days, surrounded only by material wealth but devoid of any real connection. In the other version, he saw himself transforming the property into a nature reserve, working with Ethan to preserve the mountain and its secrets, gradually reconnecting with his lost humanity. In this future, there was reconciliation, not just with his son, but also with Elizabeth, who returned to meet Ethan and the adoptive parents who raised him. When the visions ceased, Richard found himself again in the stone circle, breathless and transformed by the experience. The storm had completely ceased, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, illuminating the plateau with a golden light. What was that?" he asked, his voice unrecognizable even to himself. "The truth," answered Ethan simply, standing up and extending his hand to help him. The mountain showed what was always there, hidden under layers of pride and fear. Richard accepted the offered hand, impressed by the gentle strength in his son's grip. All these years, chasing things that in the end meant nothing. "There's still time," said Ethan, a genuine smile illuminating his face. "The mountain showed you that. The circle doesn't need to close with loneliness. It can close with redemption." Shadow approached, something in his posture different. The animal that previously seemed hostile to Richard now observed him with what could only be described as cautious acceptance. The businessman, inspired by an impulse he couldn't explain, slowly extended his hand toward the horse. To his surprise, Shadow didn't back away. He allowed Richard's fingers to lightly touch his muzzle, a gesture that sealed some kind of ancestral truce. "He forgave me?" asked Richard, incredulous. "It's not about forgiveness," answered Ethan, observing the historic moment with his sharpened senses. "It's about recognition, about accepting that we all are part of the same circle of life, and that our choices affect not just ourselves, but everything around us." As they descended the mountain side by side, father and son, different from each other in almost every aspect, but connected by bonds that went beyond blood, Richard Sterling felt a peace he had never known. The lost fortune, the crumbling empire, all that seemed insignificant compared to the discovery he had made at the top of the mountain. Days later, Elizabeth received an unexpected phone call. Richard's voice, transformed by a humility she had never heard before, told a story almost impossible to believe, about a lost and found son, about a mysterious horse that connected past and present, about a mountain that kept deep secrets and truths. "I need you to come to the mountain, Elizabeth," he said finally. "There's someone who has been waiting to meet you for a long time." On the porch of Joe and Rose Bennett's house, Ethan smiled upon hearing the final words of the conversation. At his side, the adoptive parents who had loved him unconditionally waited, nervous but hopeful, for the arrival of the woman who had cried over his loss for so long. And in the adjacent pasture, Shadow observed the scene with his wise and ancient eyes, as if he had known from the beginning that the circle would eventually close this way. Not with vengeance or cold justice, but with reconciliation and a new beginning. For the mountain, in its millennial wisdom, understood what many take lifetimes to discover. That true power lies not in dominating but in connecting, not in possessing but in belonging. A lesson that for Richard Sterling had come late, but not too late to change the course of his story.